With the highly anticipated Shadow of the Erdtree DLC looming on the horizon, the Elden Ring community has been set ablaze once again, and I am totally here for it. Over the course of just 3 minutes, we were shown an abundance of things to speculate about, both in terms of gameplay and of course the lore. And when it comes to the lore, there's one question in particular that has kept my mind occupied the most. Namely, what exactly is the Land of Shadow? Aside from being the new explorable space where the events of the DLC will play out, the very existence of this mysterious, previously unseen realm evokes a lot of questions. What is the nature and function of this world? Where is it located relative to everything else? And why was it never mentioned by anyone during the events of the base game? The same way the Fallen Leaves tell a story, I have no doubt in my mind that the Land of Shadow will have a few of its own to tell, if you're willing to dig deep enough. So let's do just that and explore a few ideas and possibilities, some of my own and some that have been put forth by others. One of the key defining features of this shadow realm is of course the curtain-like veil that stretches across the sky, like a thin, translucent fabric draped over the Land of Shadow. While there is clearly a day and night cycle present here, during the daytime the atmosphere remains somber and gloomy, a land of silhouettes bathed in an orange hue as if trapped in perpetual twilight. As for the veil itself, it appears to find its origin somewhere at the very top of the massive tree that towers over the landscape. And according to Miyazaki, this dark tree is the namesake of the DLC, the Shadow of the Erdtree. We'll talk about the Erdtree and its alleged shadowy counterpart in a later section, but first, let's talk about the land itself and what it could be. Miyazaki has shared quite a few details about the DLC in various interviews, including some hints about the history, nature, and attributes of the Land of Shadow, which definitely helps to narrow things down a bit. One thing I want to challenge is the idea that the Land of Shadow is simply a territory within the Lands Between, a stretch of land that has somehow been rendered invisible to the naked eye by some sort of magic and nothing more. While I don't doubt that there is some kind of magic involved, I suspect that it's not as simple as a mere invisibility spell or cloaking device of sorts. Now, there does exist a variety of spells, artifacts, and apparel capable of concealment or creating illusions. Methods that can render objects, people, and even entire buildings invisible or make them appear as something else in the eyes of many. That said, for every type of spell or enchantment, there usually exists either opposing magic that can counter these effects, or beings who are powerful enough to see right through the illusion. The Sentry's Torch, for example, was specifically designed by the Golden Order to counter the effects of the concealing veil used by the Black Knife assassins, rendering their disguise completely useless. More importantly, Miyazaki himself specifically states that the Shadowlands are in fact not part of the Lands Between. It is something separate, something that in his words has become physically disconnected. Lastly, he goes on to say that it technically does occupy the same space as the Lands Between, the same universe. So the way I interpret this is that the Land of Shadow seems to exist on some kind of separate plane. Not a different universe or alternate universe, as Miyazaki points out, but a different layer of reality within the same universe. A bit like the unseen world from Tolkien's Legendarium, or the Dark World and Twilight Realm from the Legend of Zelda series. And I promise this will be the only Zelda comparison I make in this video. To an extent, we've already seen hints and traces of a similar phenomena in Elden Ring, of other worlds who seem to occupy the same three-dimensional space as the Lands Between, and will occasionally intersect or bleed over into this reality. Not just the many spirits of animals and humans, but trees and forests, and weirdly enough, man-made structures as well. And while their presence can be seen and felt, they have little to no physical footprint in the Lands Between. Also, just a quick observation, which may or may not hold any relevance, but in the Lands Between, tombstones are physical objects and spirits show up as white translucent shapes. However, in the Land of Shadow, tombstones are translucent, so could this mean that it works the opposite way here? And that the spirits we saw in the Lands Between exist as physical entities inside the Shadow Realm? I don't know, maybe I'm just looking too deep into it. Another great example of two worlds or realities that seem to occupy the same space are the Everjails. As the name suggests, they serve as prison cells which exist in some kind of pocket dimension, and on the inside the terrain looks close to identical to the outside world, albeit a darker version of it. However, it's not exactly the same. Certain objects and enemies on the outside do not show up inside the Everjail and vice versa. The sentry stones that surround the Everjails, for example, are not present on the inside. And in the case of Ordina, the biggest Everjail, which covers covers an entire town, we can find statues on the inside which do not exist on the outside. Also, this could just be a coincidence, but I can't help but see a resemblance between the outer wall of the Evergaol and the veil that covers the Land of Shadow. It does look very curtain-like, but whether the Evergaol and the Land of Shadow actually share a connection, I have no idea. Anyway, if the Land of Shadow does indeed coexist with the Lands Between, just on a different plane of reality, then where would it be relative to everything else? By that I mean if you were to take the landscape itself and raise it up through the veil into the Lands Between, where on the map would it show up? This may seem like an extraneous question to ask. I mean, it's a separate reality, and will likely feature its own submap, so who cares where it is? But I think this could hold some relevance, because if you look at some of the wording used by Miyazaki, it's apparent that the Land of Shadow wasn't always like this. It's not just that it is disconnected, it has become disconnected. Of course, as is to be expected at this stage, the statements from Miyazaki, while very helpful, don't provide all the answers. For example, it doesn't explain if the Shadow Realm has always existed, or if it was created the moment these two dimensions were separated. The area we explore in the DLC could be a former province of the Lands Between that was plunged into this pre-existing shadow dimension, which as stated before would mean that somewhere on this map there used to be land, but not anymore. Alternatively, it could be that this landmass has always existed in the Shadow Realm, but that there was a time when these two worlds were connected, perhaps by some kind of rift between dimensions. A rift that could have been closed by the powers that be, cutting the two worlds off from one another. In my eyes, both options are plausible, and the truth may lie somewhere in the middle or entirely elsewhere. Though for the time being, I'm leaning more towards the idea that there was indeed a landmass here somewhere. For no other reason than I simply think it's the most compelling, not because there's more evidence for it. So I'm just gonna roll with that for now. One theory that has gained a lot of notoriety is that from a geographical standpoint, the Land of Shadow could be located here somewhere, in this very convenient gap in the middle of the continent. It's big enough to house something roughly the same size as Limgrave, which is the estimated size of the explorable space in the DLC according to Miyazaki. Furthermore, the gap is situated right in the middle of the Divine Towers, which, when viewed from above, form a very convenient circle around this exact area. The purpose of the Divine Towers and who built them has remained one of Elden Ring's many unsolved mysteries, and so tying them in with the lore behind the Land of Shadow would be a fitting answer to that mystery. Next, let's shed some light on the whole shadow theme of the DLC. Miyazaki states that the aspect of shadows will play an important role in the story, and I think that much is clear. There's the Shadow Tree, the Land of Shadow, and Mesmer, who is almost certainly another demigod child of Marika, is also said to have an element of shadow to him. Of course, shadows were already a prominent theme in Elden Ring, as well as many other of FromSoft's titles. There's the shadow-bound beasts, the baleful shadows, the Rune of Death is referred to as the Forbidden Shadow plucked from the Elden Ring, and so much more. It's a theme that FromSoft clearly loves to incorporate into their storytelling and world building. Now, thematically, shadows and darkness are most commonly used to symbolize evil. However, historically and culturally, it has much wider applications, not all of which are purely negative. In many cultures, including ancient Japanese mythology, a shadow is considered to be a part of one's very being, a reflection or extension of the soul which contains the unseen or suppressed parts of ourselves. In other words, your shadow is not just a projection of you, it is you. This is why a shadow-bound beast like Blythe is more than just Ranni's friend and protector. He is bound to her shadow and thus, quite literally, a part of her.
No. I'm part of her very being. I could never betray her.
Another aspect that is closely affiliated with Shadow is death, and I think the cemetery shades more than anything show that there is a similar connection between death and Shadow in the Elden Ring universe. The term shade originates from ancient Near Eastern cultures, where it was believed that the souls who inhabit the underworld exist as shadows. What it means for the Land of Shadow, and if it indeed serves as an underworld of some kind, is anyone's guess right now. But the fact that we do see a lot of heretical imagery, stuff like omen horns and serpents, which the Golden Order is known to persecute, does at least suggest that it's being used as a place of exile for these undesirable creatures. The final thing to discuss in relation to shadows is the concept of duality, which, as many of you know, is also a recurring theme in Elden Ring, mainly in the form of twins, mirror opposites, the concept of cycles and infinity, and so on. Now, we know that the shadow of the Earth Tree refers to this black tree. However, Miyazaki says that there's another hidden meaning in the title. I'm not sure if he's referring to the linguistics of the title only or also its design, because there is a design feature on the letter O that seems to convey yet another form of infinity or duality. It's very similar to the well-known Ouroboros symbol, except instead of two serpents devouring each other's tails, we see two trees or tree roots growing in and out of each other. Which brings us to the Ur-tree. By all accounts, the Ur-tree itself is a living organism. It grows, reproduces, withers, and will allegedly die someday. As such, it's only logical that just like any other life form, it too has a shadow of its own, which is depicted as a grim, distorted reflection of the otherwise beautiful golden tree we see in the lands between. Now, I can think of several reasons as to why the tree looks the way it does. As many have already pointed out, it actually seems to be two trees instead of just one, and the second tree has wrapped itself around the other, almost as if it's choking the life out of it. So here's a few options to consider. Option 1, the Ur-tree is being attacked by something from within. Perhaps Godwin's Deathroot, as many have suggested. Option 2, the Ur-tree is the aggressor, and is the one squeezing the life out of the other tree, possibly the fabled Great Tree, which has been theorized to have existed before the Ur-tree. Option 3, which is my personal favorite, the two trees are not to be taken literal and are more of an allegory for the Ur-tree's general well-being. Given the absence of facts at this time, all these options are equally valid interpretations, and yours may be completely different altogether. After all, these are far from the only options. But the reason why option 3 is currently my favorite is because it's subtle. It paints the Ur-tree not as a victim of some outside force, nor as an aggressor to some other entity. Instead, it simply reflects the Ur-tree's desperate attempt to stay alive. We know from various item descriptions and dialogue that the Ur-tree has indeed been dying for quite a while now. The fallen leaves tell a story after all. As far as I'm aware, we don't know exactly when this decline started, but it could have been as early as the end of the Age of Plenty, when it suddenly stopped producing its golden sap. Then came the golden seeds and subsequently the minor Ur-trees, which people used to believe couldn't exist because the Ur-tree was perfect and eternal, and thus there was no need for offspring. Yet here they are anyway. That being said, for a tree that's allegedly on the brink of death, it sure seems to be in pretty good shape, doesn't it? I mean, just look at it. Now, as usual, it could just be me looking too deep into it, but I think I'm not alone when I say that there's always been something off about the Ur-tree's appearance, especially when viewed from afar. Why does it have that transparent look to it, as if it's a projection or hologram of sorts? We don't really see this with other huge landmarks, including the minor Ur-trees. My suspicion is further amplified by the golden seed item description, which states that they are found at the base of an illusory tree. And indeed, the seeds are always found near the base of sprouts, which give off the same glow as the Ur-tree itself. So, if these sprouts are illusory, as the text says, illusory of course meaning not real, then what does that say about the Ur-tree? Could it all just be a very convincing facade? An illusion that hides the true appearance of the dying Ur-tree? I mean, it would explain why its shadow looks so warped and mangled, and almost seems to be bleeding. I suspect that just like all life in the lands between, the Ur-tree was never meant to last forever. Yet Marika and her obsession with a world without death and an age eternal seems determined to stretch out its existence far beyond its natural life cycle. After all, it's a symbol of her power and dominion over the lands between. It's a theme that I feel is captured perfectly in the item description of the Weathered Straightsword, which reads, "Though the Ur-tree styling is still visible, time has not been kind to this sword, now merely a shadow of its former self." Intentional or not, it might as well be a metaphor for the Ur-tree. Yes, it is still visibly there, looming over the lands between, a reminder of the glory days of the Golden Order and Marika's reign, but in truth there might be very little left of its former splendor, and its fated downfall has already been sealed. Naturally, this is all just my current interpretation, which is based on very limited info, and the DLC could very well prove me wrong on every single point, so do take it with a grain of salt. Now, before I wrap up the video, there's one final idea I want to discuss, and that is the possible connection between the Land of Shadow and the Numen. I'm not going to go too deep into the history of the Numen here, so if you want to know more about them, there's an abundance of amazing videos out there for you to watch. But in short, the Numen are a race of humanoids who, according to the lore, are quite rare. In fact, the literal translation of their Japanese name is rare person. They are said to be long-lived. Queen Marika herself is of Numen origin, and most important for today's topic, they come from a place outside the lands between, only known as the Lands of the Numen. The supposed Numen homeworld is only mentioned briefly in one item description, and is more than likely not its true name, mainly because the letter L is not capitalized like we see with the lands between. Aside from this little excerpt, we have zero information about the Newman homeworld. And so, unsurprisingly, there are those who suggest that the Land of Shadow might be where the Newman came from, or at the very least their ancestors did. And personally, I am totally here for it. Again, this is all just a theory, of course, but I suspect that the Land of Shadow is not necessarily the name of this particular landscape, and may instead be an umbrella term for this dimension, this other world as a whole. I guess it kinda depends if this landmass was originally located in the lands between or not, since if it was, then it only makes sense that it wasn't always called the Land of Shadow. I mean, in the trailer, one of the characters calls it the Realm of Shadow as opposed to Land of Shadow, so it might go by several names. Whatever the case, the question remains if the Newman could have originated from this Shadow Realm, which I guess would make them interdimensional visitors, so to speak. I can easily see why someone would dispute this idea, since there's no way to infer any of this from the English text. It just says that they came from outside the lands between, or from another world. That's it. Phrasing like from outside or another world tends to steer your mind towards more conventional options. You know, outside the borders of a specific territory, or a different continent, a different planet maybe. But another reality or dimension, not so much. It's not the first option my mind goes to anyway. Now, Elden Ring's localization is for the most part pretty solid. However, there have been cases where the translation does skew some of the lore, and is missing some of the nuance from the original Japanese text. Probably the most infamous example being Ranni's final speech. So let's talk for a moment about the Japanese text pertaining to the Newman. If you look up the word ikai, which is what the English text substitutes for another world, you'll notice that the majority of its translations specifically refer to a spirit world, underworld, or the next world. In fact, I believe the more conventional noun to use for another world is besekai, not ikai, which is much more specific. Now granted, ikai can also translate to an alien world or another planet. So in order to infer whether the Newman are in fact aliens from outer space, let's add some more context by looking at another Japanese word, marebito, which is the Japanese equivalent of the word Newman. As mentioned before, the literal translation of marebito is rare person or rare spirit. However, conceptually it represents a spiritual or divine visitor from the other world. They are supernatural in origin and are believed to bring gifts of wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. Now combine that with the concept of ikai and the fact that we now have some form of evidence of a shadow dimension of some kind, and I think the idea that the Newman arrived from another dimension is not at all crazy to consider. If anything, it's what the Japanese text seems to imply. It's also stated that the Shadowland is where Marika first set foot, that this is where she became a god, and that the Erdtree was born here. I do realize that to set foot somewhere could just mean that she disembarked here, like if she arrived by ship, for example. I mean, the Japanese text says something along the lines of the place where she first landed, which without further context could just as well mean that she did actually arrive by spaceship. So what it means exactly is something we probably won't find out about until June. And the same goes for pretty much everything I've said in this video. Based on the information we have right now, my money is definitely on the idea of an underworld of some kind. It would not only explain why it has remained so well hidden, but also why it's so difficult to get to. I mean, allegedly Miquella had to divest himself of his flesh, i.e. ditch his physical body in order to travel here. So perhaps under normal circumstances, only those without a physical form are able to pass through the veil, which in turn makes me wonder if Ranni and Melina knew anything about this place. After all, they too are bodiless by the time we meet them. Anyway, there's so many more questions and ideas bouncing around in my head. Heck, we haven't even touched on the Helfen Lampwood, which probably doesn't mean much to some of you given that it's entirely based on a single item description, but it's theorized to represent a dark tree whose lamplight serves as guidance for the spirits of the dead. But I'm gonna have to stop it here, or else this video will remain in the Shadow Realm, never to see the light of day. I am planning to release another video in the near future which will focus more on the characters and their possible ties to the Land of Shadow, particularly Marika, Mesmer, and of course Miquella. And who knows, maybe I can somehow fit the Helfen Lampwood in there somewhere as well. But for now, thank you so much for watching. A special thanks as always to my amazing Patreons and members for their support, and to Bradley Hobart, Mumu, and the Sidetrack for joining their ranks. That is all for now, and I hope to see you in the next video.